Contacted me at the very end of November and asked if I'd give a talk at this conference. And I know he wanted me to talk about narrative. I wasn't sure how he wanted me to talk about narrative. And he said the word social change, and immediately in my head, I mean, I could have talked about my work about integrative medicine, but that isn't what came into my head with social change. I was feeling very upset at the news that particular day about yet another incident in a whole litany of incidents in which, in my former beloved city of Chicago, yet another young African-American boy, really, was gunned down for what seemed to be no apparent reason to me, and died by gunfire. And this is part of an ever-going list of these incidents, and it was very upsetting to me. So I had planned to talk about this phenomena of getting shot while walking while black in the US, but then certain things happened where it seemed to me that, and I'll explain this a little later in the talk, where I really had to enlarge it to the whole topic of gun violence in the US. And I want to say right at the beginning, make a disclaimer, I am not any kind of expert on gun violence. I hope I have some expertise in narrative inquiry and narrative approaches. So this talk really, in a way, came out of me as, in my private person, as being a very concerned and actually very worried citizen about what's happening in the US. And I am going to take a narrative approach in talking about it. One of the things that worries me in terms of this topic of gun violence, in terms of social change, is, and again, this is my personal perspective and experience, but is that in the US we're having change for the worse, continually worse, and I don't see any ready remedies in sight. And so how did that fit with me with thinking about narrative? And I thought back to 3 years ago, right before Christmas in 2012, and some of you, those of you in the US, from the US, I know will recognize this, but it may not be so recognizable to other people from other places. Anyhow, a 20-year-old, very disturbed young man made his way into an elementary school with a semi-automatic weapon. I see Pauline shaking her head, so she is familiar with it. In a nice suburban middle-class town called Newtown, Connecticut, and walked into a first-grade classroom. And it's hard for me to talk about this. And gunned down 20 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds. And another 6 people who were teachers and staff who were trying to protect the children. I'm not the only one who tears up about this. President Obama referenced it the other day in his news conference, and tears streamed down his face as well. And so, for me, I'll never forget that story. And as a story, it has all the attributes, the narrative attributes that go into making a story. So we have this, I think, pretty confused antagonist. You might call him a villain. I'm not sure if he was, but he was definitely an antagonist. We have the most innocent of victims, a never explained motive of why that young man chose that particular situation, the setting in which the violence took place in an elementary school, the context, and we learned something afterward about the context in which the shooter lived and how he obtained those weapons, which was legally through his mother, who, by the way, he also shot. And the devastation that one feels when one hears that story. And that's a story that will forever remain with me. And it's in this topic of gun violence in the US, it's harder for me to think of a narrative that is more powerful. And in the days after this happened, I mean, we heard the news reports, and then we started to see the individual photographs of each of the children and their parents talking about each of them, who that child was, and giving memorials in that sense. And it was kind of overwhelming, and yet it's 3 years later. Nothing has changed in terms, except getting worse, in the situation about gun violence. And for many people, I'm sure if they thought consciously about that story, they might also become emotional or at least moved, but for most people, it's kind of way in the background in history now. And so when I thought about giving this talk, I thought, if a story like that doesn't make a difference, and we're not having social change in a positive direction, why not? And why have people become inattentive even to a narrative with this much power? So that kind of became my inquiry for exploring this topic, and trying to think it through from a narrative point of view, and to see if I could gain any insight about that. So we'll see how I do. I'll get a little academic here. I want to say something about what I mean when I talk about narrative. That's a word that's been used already quite a few times this morning and last night. I'm coming from the work of rhetorician Walter Fisher, who I think is the main person who introduced narrative theory into communication studies. Of course, we don't own narrative. Narrative is explored by any number of fields, literature and history and so forth. For me, I use the terms narrative and story interchangeably. Not everybody does. Some make distinctions about the theory and the practice with those words, but I'm going to use them as synonyms as I talk today. And what Fisher taught us is that narrative can become a paradigm for thinking about all of human communication, because he saw humans as storytellers by instinct and by birth, that we are all innate storytellers, and that the vast predominance of our communication can be seen in story form and can be understood that way. Now, he did say there was an exception, and the exception he named is that communication that is technical argument, that is strictly shaped and enforced by rules of specific rationalities. And he talked about things like scientific argument or kind of more abstract philosophical argument doesn't work so well as narrative, but the predominance of how we communicate can be seen by narrative as narrative. And in one way or the other, it may not be a full-blown story, but we can find in the way people speak or write or communicate in other ways the basic or essential qualities of narrative, which include how we portray people as characters in a story, how we attribute motives to explain behavior or action, the scene and the timing in which a particular story is set, is given context. And this is one of the most important things, how we explain human action in terms of tensions that exist, which are all tensions are all over the place, between people or between people and institutions or among organizations. All those tensions and how they get worked out through communication become plot lines in a story. Also, it's not only what is in the story, but it's how the story is told. So the process of storytelling, or who the storyteller is another important ingredient or attribute of narrative. And finally, the goodness or the importance of a story is often measured by what we walk away from having heard a story, so that there are moral lessons. What is it that we take away from a story? And not all stories are great stories, but those that are great, I think we walk away with a moral lesson. I also want to refer very briefly to a model, and this one has cultural in the name as well. This is not a rival of Mohan and Ambar's cultural centered approach. This is actually a model that was developed about probably 15 years before the culture centered approach, and it came out of the work that I did with a colleague while I was working in medical school, a physician colleague, and one of our main jobs was to prepare doctors in training to be better communicators with their patients. And there were, in the setting where we worked, there were vast cultural differences between who the doctors were and who their patients were. Just like Icha was talking about in her presentation. And so we developed this model as kind of part of a training program or a teaching program. And basically, the model is levels of meaning. And if you can picture a computer operating system, because that was our metaphor at the time, all these levels of meaning, ideological, socio-political, institutional, professional, ethnocultural, and family. We put family with ethnocultural because we saw the family as a major conduit of culture. And the interpersonal are all kinds of meanings that are running all the time. So in the computer, all of these levels of meaning are there, and they're always present, they're always running. However, in any particular incidence of communication, some of those levels of meaning become more prominent or more salient, depending on the situation and what's being talked about. In teaching the doctors, what we were teaching them was sometimes what's most prominent or important to them, and oftentimes it was at the professional level, being a doctor, might not sync at all with what is most important for the patient, who was operating at another level of meaning. And that's the way we were trying to explain it to our trainees. And that those differences in emphasis, in meaning, then resulted in how well people can understand one another, how good a relationship they might form, so the what and the how of communication, and then what the outcomes of that communication were. So in a nutshell, that's the model, and you don't have to really dwell on that. But the reason I decided to just reference the model is because as I talk about the gun violence issue, the levels of meaning, particularly at the ideological level and the socio-political level, are going to come into play, and I think you'll see that in what I say. I will even touch upon the professional and familial levels of meaning. So that's as academic as I'm going to get in terms of theory or concepts. Oops. Okay. So then I began to delve into the issue of gun violence, and as I said, I'm just a concerned citizen. But in trying to prepare for this talk, I started to do research. And if you just look up, do your own little survey of going through things on the internet about the last 5 years in the US, about gun violence, you will see a mind-blowing list of where incidents, deadly incidents, have happened in all manner of places. So the schools, and I reference Newtown, of course, a lot in colleges and universities, workplaces, military bases, shopping centers, recently in a church, in a movie theater, everywhere. It's all around us. The best statistic I could find in terms of deaths by guns is over 32,000 a year, so it's kind of at epidemic proportions. And then this one just came out at the end of the year as people were looking back on 2015, that in the US there was an average of 1 mass shooting a day, some of which have gotten a lot of attention, some have not. But it looked to me as I was looking at that I don't know if there is an actual definition for mass shootings, but the ones that I saw reported involved 4 people or more, not necessarily 4 deaths, but it was a combination of people that were killed by guns and people that were gravely wounded. Another piece of research, this isn't a statistic, this came out of someone's research, is that having a gun in one's home is associated with a 3-fold increase in the risk of a homicide. And then the next statistics after this, and I really couldn't verify this just seems incredibly high to me. But I found it in 2 sources. That the number of privately owned, and this is small firearms, like a revolver, per 100 residents in the U.S., well, actually, it was a worldwide chart, and the U.S. was at the top of the chart with 88.9% of people having guns in the house. I find that kind of hard to believe. So I put a question mark beside it because that just seems incredibly high to me. But I think the U.S. being #1 in the world is maybe the really important message there. And then it went through all these countries, and just so for the sake of comparison, I wanted to see where Singapore was. And that was 0.5 guns per 100 residents. And in terms of worldwide statistics, it was tied with several other countries, and interestingly in this region, Indonesia, Fiji, and then Eritrea, at 161 in the world. So Singapore is, by comparison, infinitely safer, but I think we knew that. And then this is a comparison of gun fatalities per 100,000 people. Again, a worldwide comparison. Again, the U.S. at the top of the list. The gun fatalities include suicide, which is an increasing problem in the U.S. as well as part of the whole gun violence thing. And again, Singapore is down there at 0.16, only beat out by Japan at 0.06. So those statistics to me said something about where the U.S. is as a civil society at this point. But it's also an issue of health, public health. Although, as you'll see, some people find that an arguable point. So another kind of amazing factoid is that as of 2014, deaths by gun violence surged past auto accidents as the causative factor. The U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Murthy, said whenever you have large numbers of people who are dying for preventive reasons, then that constitutes a public health issue. And she listed what she considers the 5 major public health issues. And I don't remember all of them. I think walkable neighborhoods was one, diet-related factors was another, but at the top of the list was gun violence. Now that made a lot of sense to me, and I see death by guns as a public health problem, but here's a contrasting storyline. So John Boehner, who was up until I guess 2 months ago, he's from the Republican Party in the U.S. and was the Speaker of the House, so he was in a pretty high legislative position, said the CDC, which is our Centers for Disease Control, the CDC is there to look at diseases that need to be dealt with to protect public health. I'm sorry, but a gun is not a disease. Guns don't kill people, people do. So there is your contrasting storyline or narrative. Kind of, at least it alludes to it, that guns are not a danger that the government should be involved in controlling. And that leads to kind of what I'm calling the meta-narratives of people in the U.S. who are advocates of gun rights versus people who feel it is time to limit at least the availability of guns. So two big storylines. So I go back to the story of Newtown and the whole notion of narrative inattention. Why is it that the American public is seemingly paying so little attention? I would say right at the present time, and I couldn't have anticipated this at the time I chose this topic, but right this minute it is a hot button issue, and I think people are paying attention at least to those two major plot lines that I talked about. But the stories that we hear over and over again, which are powerful, heartrending stories, people read them and then become inattentive. And so part of this inquiry is to try and uncover why that is, why they're not sticking with people. So we have the quote from the New York Times: in fact, guns remain the only consumer product not regulated at the federal level for health and safety, in keeping with the wishes of the gun industry and compliant lawmakers, and I will elaborate on that. But for me, the questions for the remaining inquiry is, why has there been so little social change, little change in the incidence of gun violence, and why has the U.S. public been what seems to be inattentive to the repeated, tragic, infuriating to me, frightening stories of violence and victimage. Stories don't exist in a vacuum. They are always contextualized by the times in which they are told, by the history that precedes them, by other conversations that are taking place at the same time. So I tried to step back to look at the context in which these gun violence stories are being told. And as I told you with the model, I think the ideologic level of meaning is really pertinent here. And when I use the term ideology, what I'm referring to are deep-seated beliefs that underlie actions that people take. Oftentimes they have a historical prelude to them. They have evolved through history, and they may be explicitly stated or they may be implicitly assumed. In the U.S., I think both explicitly and implicitly, there has been throughout the history of the country a tradition of honoring, emphasizing individualism. So those of you who have studied culture, you know there are societies in which the community or communalism is the prime value in the U.S. It doesn't mean we don't have communities or that we don't care about them, but when it comes down to it, the individual is always kind of the primary, given the emphasis. If you're listening to CNN or following the story in the U.S. at all, you have heard or you will be hearing in the next couple days a lot of emphasis on the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Those amendments are part of our Bill of Rights, goes back to 1792. Defenders of the Second Amendment, which says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And this becomes the basis in which people who feel the government has no right to limit the legal possession of guns needs to keep out. Oftentimes, just the second part of that sentence is quoted, and I kind of think that's important because I think the Founding Fathers, when they talked about a well-regulated militia, had something a little different in mind when they talked about people's right to bear arms. But that part kind of gets ignored. Also, the Founding Fathers were not anticipating semi-automatic weapons that can kill dozens of people in one round. Along with the ideological context, there's a historical context. And I didn't quote this from any particular source. This is kind of my own take on it. But I feel like guns have always been present as a force in American society, for good or for bad. It's part of the history of the country. And I gave some examples. This isn't meant to be exhaustive, but the culture of the Wild West, where people did arm themselves. They had shootouts. They brought off the Indians, and we could talk about that whole thing. But you see cowboys and Indians, and the cowboys have the guns, and the Indians have bows and arrows. I have lived in the past 17 years in Texas, which is still the Wild West as far as I'm concerned. When I first moved to Chicago, in the late 1970s, it's been a long time, and I lived there for 20 years, but when I moved to Chicago and I traveled, and I told people, especially in other countries, that I lived in Chicago, at that time the response always was, people from other countries would go, "Oh, Chicago." And they were thinking of like the gangsters from the 1920s and 30s, and associated Chicago with Al Capone and John Dillinger and outlaws like that. So a gun response was always what I got from saying I lived in Chicago. In Chicago now, sadly, we have a contemporary version of gangsters, who might call themselves gangstas, and there's a whole gangsta culture, and that's reflected in rap music and the way people dress and a lot of other things, and some of that is colorful and harmless. But there's still a lot of shooting in Chicago, and unfortunately, and here's where race and ethnicity comes in. Most of it has been centered on the south side of Chicago, which is very predominantly African American. Also the west side, which is more Latino and Hispanic, where every week there are totals of, and it's usually men, usually young men of color, who are killing each other with guns. Not infrequently, there are innocent bystanders to those stories where a child may be inadvertently killed or some other innocent bystander. Chicago statistics have been pretty gruesome, but it is indicative of urban life in the U.S. in many cities. Collins, just having moved to the St. Louis area, I'm sure is familiar with some of the same scenarios there and in other cities throughout the U.S. There are entrenched family and community cultures that have to do with guns. Some of these have to do with hunting, which, as long as you get a license, is legal in the U.S., however you feel about that ideologically. But it's very strong and culturally entrenched, and particularly in rural areas of the country, but not only rural areas. And guns are even many times part of family traditions. They're heirlooms that may get handed down from grandfather to grandson or other people in the family. So a strong historical context for gun culture. The political culture in which these stories are being talked about, and there may be other parts of the political culture, but I feel like this is for me, the really important one. There is an organization called the National Rifle Association, or the NRA, and there are other gun rights groups. The NRA in particular is and has been for decades a very vocal and powerful political lobby. And the fact is that they have considerable sway with legislators, both at the state and the federal levels, and are on the watch for legislation that might limit people's access to guns, and they are opposed to that. They have the NRA has a very large membership, and that's public knowledge. What is maybe less private, or less public, more private knowledge is that they have also very strong association with firearms industries, the people that manufacture guns. So that helps to strengthen their lobby and give them more persuasion with legislators. And this particular story, I think some people may have known this before, but I think it's just now coming more into public view, and that is that in 1996, researchers at the Centers for Disease Control were doing research about the causes of gun violence and the repercussions of that. And the NRA was not happy to see that research coming out, and accused the Centers for Disease Control of using science, using their research to actually lobby for gun control. So they were kind of calling them political toadies. Because the NRA is influential with Congress, the Congress people that were influenced by the NRA threatened in a very real way to withhold funding from the Centers for Disease Control. So starting back 20 years ago, the CDC stopped doing all research on gun violence. 2 years ago, in 2013, following the Newtown massacre, President Obama formally asked the CDC to start resuming their research on gun violence, and it hasn't happened yet. There have been previous efforts and certainly current efforts to have the opposite kind of lobby. There are organizations that certainly exist to curb gun violence. After the attempted assassination, oh, I forgot to mention the presidential assassinations, okay. After the attempted assassinations on President Ronald Reagan and his press secretary, James Brady, was shot. Actually, Reagan was shot too. He didn't die of his wounds, but he was critically injured. The Bradys, James and Sarah, his wife, began to be very active in trying to organize to curb guns. And the Brady organization is still works to do that. But there are newer ones. One of our congresswomen, Gabby Giffords, was meeting with constituents, as she often did, to get community input at a shopping center, and someone walked right up to her and to several other people around her and shot her. Again, she wasn't killed, but she was forever injured. And so she and her husband, Mark Kelly, who's an astronaut, have become active with other people for gun control. And Gabby Giffords, by the way, she came from a family in which hunting was a matter of course. She had guns in her house. But she's making a distinction between being conversant with guns and trying to curb their use in a violent way against other people. Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York City, is an active advocate for gun control, and so forth. After Newtown, people thought, well, something's really going to happen now. And there were groups formed at that time that continued to work, but nothing really has changed. What I did forget to say when I talked about the gun culture is about presidential assassinations. There have been 16 presidents in which one or more assassination attempts, most of which are by gun. There might have been one or two by poisons or explosives attempted, but we've had 16 attempted. More than 16, but 16 presidents, and of those, 4 have been killed by guns, and probably you're most familiar with Abraham Lincoln and John Kennedy. So the incident that happened at the time that Mohan contacted me, that caused me to try and look into this, I'm going to show a very brief news clip, and it is going to be brief, which is part of the situation, really. But let me just show the clip, and we could talk about what happened.
Warn our viewers, what you are about to see is disturbing video of this police officer shooting and killing this 17-year-old teenager. We'll show you the video right now, but if you don't want to see it, this is a good time to turn your head away.
That's the teenager going down the street. police car goes by, and
there you see the 17-year-old Laquan McDonald. He was jaywalking there on the street. This is dash cam video from the police vehicle. He is lying there on the street right there, and the police officer, Jason Van Dyke, 37 years old, shoots him. We've stopped that video at that. There's no audio on the video. We've stopped it at that point, but you get the point. Once he's down on the ground, the video shows that he goes over there and shoots him some more. Actually, would you watch this? We're going to continue showing the video. There you see other police cars, other police officers arriving on the scene.
We can stop it there. He was shot 16 times. And so I was extremely upset in watching this. As I said, it's part of a long, long list of similar events. This was particularly brutal. But then what happened was, that was, I think that was reported on November 25th. It had been preceded by the shootings in Paris, and I'm gonna connect the dots here. And a week later, it was followed by the shootings in San Bernardino by the domestic terrorists. And in the background of all these stories, there were other things happening. There were trials that exonerated 2 other police departments for the killing of 2 other young black males. One was not, the Freddie Gray case in Baltimore was not a gun shooting. Mr. Gray was arrested on the way to the police department. He was given what they called a rough ride in the police wagon, and was injured mortally from being banged around inside the police car. And poor Tamir Rice was a 12-year-old boy living in Cleveland who was playing with a toy gun in the park, and a police car came by and within seconds had shot the boy, mistaking him for an older male and the toy gun for a real gun. So all these stories are circulating basically at around the same time. One doesn't have to do with guns, but it does have to do with the killing of a young black man. And that this is part of my point, which is all these incidents, even though they're about different things, they're about international terrorism, they're about domestic terrorism, they're about police shootings, all happening at around the same time and being circulated in the news, become kind of an undifferentiated mass of information about what's happening out there in different ways. And I called that, this isn't any official term in the literature, I called that narrative whiplash, because the rapidity of events that are loosely connected, that get covered on a 24/7 media coverage, which sometimes can be spotty and leave out some parts, and other times become kind of obsessive in tracking down a story, and you're hearing it over and over again. This is how we receive narratives. And then there is the visual part, and I think that's actually been a really good addition with the ever-present cameras that people have on their phones, and in this, the case you just saw was on the dashboard of the police car. We now have a visual component to add to the stories. It's enough to literally and figuratively make one's head spin, and it contributes to our ability to focus on any one part for very long, anyhow. With the amount of information coming in, it encourages forgetfulness about stories in general, or about certain details connected to a story, and it tends to dissipate how we emotionally respond to the stories we hear, or follow-up commitment that we may have, because there's so much information coming in. Narrative whiplash, I'm arguing, is one result of the way the stories are told. Okay, another term I made up is narrative fatigue, which I think is the result of the narrative whiplash. In terms of gun violence, I guess that's a little hard to see. There's different subcategories, and I tried to separate these out. So there's common crimes that are committed with the use of guns, which might be robberies, home invasions, gang violence. Yeah, I'm worried about them seeing it too. We have something called road rage, where people get mad at each other in traffic and take out guns and shoot one another, so I put that under common crimes. In-home or domestic incidents, and one of the really sad things about this is statistics about children finding unlocked guns at home. Actually, with accidental deaths at home from guns, toddlers are the main victims of that. But we also have conflicts between spouses, the suicides that I referred to before. Then there are stories that revolve around mental illness, like the Newtown example. And we have many of those. It seems many of the shootings, like at universities, some on military bases, are people that have a mental illness problem, have access to gun, and act out in that way. Not all of these, but a lot of these, at least for the school shootings, and here race and ethnicity comes in again, seem to be kind of lonely young white guys. Not all, but a lot of them have been. The mass rampages, and you see that I have those two things touching one another because there's overlap between mental illness and the mass rampages. As I've just shown you, deadly force used by law enforcement. What doesn't get so much play, and just to be fair, is that there is also the opposite kind of violence of police officers getting shot. It's just that the incidence of that is a lot less than the other way around. Domestic terrorism now has, since San Bernardino, has become a scary thing, and also the Paris shootings were domestic terrorism. And so that overlaps with the mass rampages. And then just some other factors in the background. So as I've already talked about with the police shootings, there's a real racial, ethnic component to that, where particularly young black men seem to be the target of those shootings when they occur. And And then there is the current fight that President Obama has now has made a big point of stepping into in terms of gun acquisition and what constitutes legal registration. They're not even talking about getting rid of all guns. I don't know when that would ever happen in the U.S. because of that constitutional basis, but in terms of limiting people's access to guns, that's a big issue. And then lately, the fear of immigrants and ISIS, and that is very vague. It's not very specifically tied to most of this, except maybe for that, well, the domestic terrorism, not so much, but there was an immigrant involved in San Bernardino, so that's in the background too. All of which leading to narrative fatigue, that we have overlapping and conflicting stories, leading to confusion and feelings of being overwhelmed with the sum total of this. So how is a concerned, attentive, responsible citizen, how do they make sense of all this, basically, is what I'm asking. We already talked about the meta-narratives, and just to preview some things that are on the horizon, which make me even more, feeling more negative and despairing, is in a couple states now, and my state is one of them. While there are groups that are lobbying for control of guns, at the other end there are people that, and to some degree they're winning, of making guns more prominent. Let me put, it's not about accessibility, but it is about prominence. So there have been concealed weapon laws on the books for a long time where people who legally access guns can carry them in a concealed way. So basically, this shouldn't make me feel any better because they're out there, but they're concealed. But now there is something called open carry laws, and they've been passed in a couple states, including Texas, in which people will legally carry openly visible guns around. Meaning, I can anticipate going to the supermarket or going shopping in other places, going to possibly going to place of worship, although private organizations do have a right to limit this. But in public, going to work, being treated in a clinical hospital, there may be people running around in front of me with exposed guns, and yes, professors, it's coming to your classroom soon. So that's on the horizon in the US. And if I sound despairing, I kind of am. The last point I want to make is about who are the storytellers in these main narratives, because I think that could make a difference. But unfortunately, I'm not seeing on the immediate horizon, with possible 2 exceptions, really extraordinary, compelling storytellers who might make a difference in how all of this is going in the US. I think a person who had the moral authority plus the great communication skills of a Pope Francis could be a storyteller who could make a difference. But he's busy with other things, and the US isn't his main problem. So I'm very, and feel free to argue with me, I'm very sorry to say that the most compelling storyteller I see right now is Mr. Donald Trump. who a lot of people are listening to, and who will see what the next couple months could bring. He could be an actual presidential candidate, which is very disturbing to me. In the last couple days, President Obama has stepped forward. Every time one of these incidents happens, Obama comes out to make a statement. And I will say, for disclosure, I'm an Obama fan. He's not perfect, but I think he's been really a very good president. And you could just see every time he comes out how weary he is of having to go through the same kind of tragic aftermath of all these events. Now in the U.S., usually the president has to convince the Congress to take legislative action. That hasn't happened very often between President Obama and the U.S. Congress. It happened with Obamacare kind of by the skin of his teeth, but not much since then. So what he has done is to take executive action within his legal right to do so, and that's what he's trying to do now to curb guns, and the Republican Congress is very unhappy with him about that. So in the next month or two, we will see if he is able to effect a change. But he's going to have to come out and tell a very compelling story about limiting gun use to get things to swing in his direction. And so that's where it lies. And with that, I'm going to call it quits and see if you have responses or questions.